This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com. Hey there everyone, and welcome to In Range. I'm Cameron Harris, and this is episode number 23. Now, you've probably heard of insulin pumps, but you might not know the basics of how they work if you don't personally use one. So that's what we're going to talk about today, the insulin pump. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with the typical way of giving insulin, which is through injections. You have a syringe like this one, you draw the appropriate amount of insulin into the syringe, and then you inject it. Now, an insulin pump makes that way easier because you don't need to calculate anything. You just tell it how many carbs you ate, what your number is, and then it calculates how much insulin you need. And because it's always connected to you through a site, you just have to push a button and it gives you the insulin. There's no syringes, there's no vials, it's way easier. Now, the really cool thing is you hardly ever feel that site. It just uses a really small piece of really strong adhesive, kind of like a really strong Band-Aid, to stay attached to you. And then there's either a little rubber tube called a cannula or a small needle that is used to get the insulin through your skin. Now, you do have to swap out the site every 3 days to avoid infection. But when you think about it, that's like taking an injection every 3 days rather than 5 or 6 times a day. So a pump can certainly make things easier, but it can also help keep your numbers in line more so than normal injections. Now, I was resistant to the idea of an insulin pump for a long time. The idea of having something attached to me 24/7 just didn't appeal to me at all. But once I hit my teen years, my numbers started going haywire. Now, my doctor recommended I switch to an insulin pump. Now, sure enough, within a couple of weeks of switching, my numbers started to level out. But why, you ask? It's just giving the same insulin. Well, because of something called a basal rate. When you're on injections, small bursts of insulin over the course of a day isn't enough to keep your numbers in check. That's because you always need a small amount of insulin in your system to keep your numbers down. So that's why every 24 hours you take a dose of a special kind of insulin called long-acting insulin. Now, you might be taking something called NPH, you may be taking something called Lantus, they're kind of the same thing. Now, one of the pitfalls of using long-acting insulin is that it loses its effectiveness the longer it stays in your system. So its effectiveness over 24 hours looks something like this. It starts out very high, but it loses its potency over the course of the day. Another problem with this is that you have no control over how much of it is in your system at any given time. Now, when you're on an insulin pump, however, it's not using background insulin. It's giving you small little dosages of insulin, really tiny amounts, constantly every few minutes over the course of the day, which is more similar to the way an actual pancreas works. That's called your basal rate, and its effectiveness looks more like this over the course of 24 hours. Because you're getting fresh insulin all the time, it's always just as effective as the last dosage, which is fantastic. The other great thing is you have complete control over your basal rate setting. It's just a setting in your pump, and you can change it from 1.1 to 1.2 and so on. Now, a setting of, let's say, 1.2 would mean that you're getting 1.2 units of insulin per hour. So you can see the dosages themselves are incredibly small. Now, this doesn't replace your normal meal injections. So whenever you eat carbs, you still have to give yourself larger amounts of insulin. This is just kind of background throughout the day to keep your numbers in check. Now, another nice benefit of using a basal rate instead of long-acting insulin is that you can actually change your basal rate depending on the time of day. So let's say you're something like me, where in the morning you need more insulin than normal to keep your numbers in range. Well, if that's the case, you can just change your basal rate. So say, for example, in the morning from 6 to 10, my basal rate is 1.4 instead of 1.2, but then after that it goes back down to 1.2 for the rest of the day. This is way more accurate than using something like NPH or Lantus. Now, of course, there are a couple of cons to using a pump. For one thing, if your pump ever breaks, Your pump manufacturer should replace it free of charge, but it'll take time to ship that to you, so during that time you will have to go back to injections and long-acting insulin. Also, the system sometimes doesn't work quite as well as it should. Sometimes the cannula or needle will get clogged or bent, or the site will just come straight out, or you'll get little clogs or kinks in the tubing without your knowing it, and that will cause the pump to not be able to deliver the insulin that you need. That causes you to get ketones. So you got to kind of keep an eye on yourself a little bit more than usual, but if you do that, then you should be able to catch this stuff really quickly before it gets too bad. Now, pumps certainly aren't the answer for everyone, so as cliche as it sounds, ask your doctor before you make the switch. They'll be able to tell you if it's a good idea or not, and if it is, they'll be able to help you find out which brand and which model pump to go with. There are all kinds of features out there. Some have meters, blood sugar meters that actually communicate wirelessly with the pump. Some are waterproof, some have larger capacities for insulin than others. So you want to make sure you find the right mix of features for you, then go with that model. So until next time, be sure to visit our website at www.harwoodpodcast.com. There we've got the show notes, links to all the stuff we talk about, all kinds of great stuff. And if you have any questions or comments for me, you can send me an email at cameron@harwoodpodcast.com. I'll see you guys next time. And good luck staying in range.